What started as a routine bank visit turned into a nightmare that would expose one of the most sophisticated domestic abuse operations law enforcement had ever seen. When millionaire Blake Harrison shoved his 6 months pregnant wife Victoria in front of shocked customers, he had no idea security cameras were rolling. But this wasn't just about one moment of violence. This was about a calculated system of psychological destruction, illegal drugging, and a criminal empire that used domestic abuse to silence witnesses. Victoria's fight for survival would uncover money laundering, multiple suspicious deaths, and a network of victims spanning years. By the end of this story, you'll understand how one woman's courage brought down a multi-million-dollar criminal organization. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story about justice. Subscribe for more true crime content, and drop a comment with your thoughts. Let's dive into this incredible case. The security camera footage would later show everything in stark, silent detail. At 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, Blake Harrison strode through the marble lobby of First National Bank like he owned the building, which, considering his real estate empire, he practically did. His pregnant wife Victoria trailed behind him, one hand pressed protectively against her 6-month belly, the other clutching a manila envelope. Even on the grainy footage, her exhaustion was visible in every careful step. Blake stopped abruptly at the customer service counter, his voice carrying across the hushed space. "My wife seems to think she needs access to our emergency account. Perhaps you can explain to her why that's unnecessary." Victoria stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Blake, please. The doctor said if I miss another appointment, he'll have to report it to—" "Report what?" Blake's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "That my wife is having a perfectly normal pregnancy under the care of the best physicians money can buy." The bank manager, Samantha Mitchell, recognized Victoria immediately. They'd been roommates at Northwestern, back when Tori had dreams of running her own marketing firm. Sam hadn't seen her friend in over a year, not since Blake had gradually isolated her from everyone who'd known her before. "Mrs. Harrison," Sam approached carefully, noting how Victoria flinched at her married name. "Is there something I can help you with today?" Blake answered before Victoria could speak. "My wife has been experiencing some emotional instability with the pregnancy. Her doctor recommended I handle our finances to reduce stress." Sam watched Victoria's face crumble slightly. This wasn't the confident woman who'd graduated summa cum laude, who'd landed 3 job offers before graduation. This was someone who'd been systematically broken down. "Actually," Victoria said suddenly, finding her voice, "I need to access the emergency fund. Blake, you promised I could use it for medical expenses." Blake's mask slipped for just a moment. "Rebecca, we discussed this at home. You're being irrational." "My name is Victoria," she said quietly, but firmly. "And I'm not being irrational. I'm being responsible." The lobby fell silent. Other customers turned to stare. Blake's face flushed red as he realized he was losing control of the narrative in public. "You're embarrassing yourself," he hissed, grabbing her arm hard enough that she gasped. "We're leaving, now." "Blake, you're hurting me. I said we're leaving." He pulled her toward the exit, but Victoria planted her feet, finally reaching her breaking point. "No, I'm not going anywhere until I get access to my own money." That's when Blake Harrison, pillar of the community and multi-millionaire philanthropist, shoved his 6 months pregnant wife hard enough to send her stumbling backward into a marble pillar. Victoria's scream echoed through the bank as she fell, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. The manila envelope scattered its contents across the floor. Medical bills, past due notices, appointment cards from a free clinic across town. Sam was already calling 911 as Blake dropped to his knees beside Victoria, instantly transforming into the concerned husband. "Oh my God, honey, are you okay? She's been having dizzy spells. Someone call an ambulance." But Sam had seen everything, and the security cameras had recorded it all. As sirens wailed in the distance, Victoria looked up at her former roommate with eyes full of pain and something that might have been hope. For the first time in 18 months, someone had witnessed the truth about her marriage to Blake Harrison. Detective Ryan Murphy had seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the signs immediately. The pregnant woman lying on the hospital gurney had the hollow look of someone who'd been systematically destroyed from the inside out. "Mrs. Harrison," he said gently, pulling up a chair beside her bed, "I'm Detective Murphy. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened at the bank. Victoria's eyes darted nervously around the room. Where's Blake? He said he was just getting coffee. Your husband is speaking with my partner in the waiting room. Right now, I'd like to hear your version of events. Thus, Rachel Thompson entered, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Ball Harrison, I have your test results. The good news is your baby appears to be fine. However, I am concerned about some of your blood work. Victoria's brow furrowed. Concerned how Thompson glanced at Detective Murphy, then back at her patient. There are traces of a sedative in your system. Lorazepam. Are you taking any anti-anxiety medication? No, Victoria said immediately. Blake handles all my medications, but he said they were just prenatal vitamins. Murphy leaned forward. Mrs. Harrison, has your husband been giving you medication without your knowledge? Before Victoria could answer, Blake burst through the door with his attorney in tow. Tori, sweetheart, how are you feeling? I was so worried when you collapsed like that. The transformation was instant. Victoria seemed to shrink into herself, her moment of clarity evaporating under Blake's concerned performance. I'm fine, she whispered. Just tired. Blake's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Crawford, stepped forward. Detective, my client is obviously concerned about his wife's well-being. Perhaps we could discuss this at a more appropriate time. Murphy stood his ground. Actually, sir, this is the appropriate time. We have security footage of your client assaulting his pregnant wife. Blake's expression shifted to one of hurt confusion. Assault detective, my wife has been struggling with paranoid delusions since her pregnancy began. Our family physician can verify that she's been increasingly unstable. That's not true, Victoria said weakly, but her voice lacked conviction. Honey, Blake sat on the edge of her bed, taking her hand with practiced gentleness. Remember what Dr. Hartley said about the pregnancy affecting your perception of reality? You thought the bank teller was plotting against you too. Victoria's face went pale. Murphy watched as Blake's gaslighting worked in real time, making her doubt her own memory of events that had happened less than 2 hours ago. Mrs. Harrison, Murphy said firmly, I want you to know that what happened at the bank was captured on security cameras. You are not imagining things. Blake's smile never wavered, but his grip on Victoria's hand tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course it was captured. Everyone saw my wife having another episode, and me trying to help her to safety. Crawford stepped forward with a manila folder. Detective, we've taken the liberty of gathering some documentation that might help you understand the situation better. Murphy opened the folder to find psychiatric evaluations, medical reports, and witness statements, all painting Victoria as mentally unstable and Blake as a devoted husband struggling with his wife's declining mental health. These documents were prepared remarkably quickly, Murphy observed. When you have resources and you're trying to protect your family, you work fast. Blake replied smoothly. Dr. Thompson checked her watch. I'm going to need to keep Mrs. Harrison overnight for observation. The fall could have caused complications we can't detect immediately. Blake stood. Of course. I'll stay with her. Actually, Victoria said suddenly, I'd like some time alone, to rest. Blake's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. But he recovered quickly. Whatever you need, sweetheart. I'll be right outside if you need anything. After Blake and his lawyer left, Murphy sat back down. Mrs. Harrison, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What your husband just did in this room, that's called gaslighting. He's making you doubt your own memories and perceptions. Victoria stared at the ceiling. What if he's right? What if I am losing my mind? The security footage doesn't lie, and neither does the drug test. Your husband has been medicating you without your consent and then using your resulting confusion to control you. For the first time since the bank incident, Victoria met his eyes directly. What happens now? Murphy pulled out his business card. Now we build a case, but I need you to be completely honest with me about everything that's been happening in your marriage. Victoria took the card with trembling fingers. Outside her room, Blake Harrison was already making phone calls, activating a network of connections and resources that had served him well for years. But this time, he'd made his first real mistake. He'd hurt his wife in public, in front of cameras, with witnesses who couldn't be bought or intimidated. The war for Victoria's life was just beginning. By morning, Victoria's world had shifted on its axis. Blake arrived at the hospital with coffee, flowers, and the kind of worried smile that fooled everyone except Detective Murphy, who watched from the hallway. "The press has got a wind of the incident," Blake said, settling into the visitor's chair with practiced ease. "I've issued a statement about your medical condition. Nothing too specific, just enough to explain why you've been acting erratically." Victoria sat up straighter. "What kind of statement?" Blake pulled out his phone, scrolling to a news article. "Millionaire businessman supports wife through pregnancy-related mental health struggles." It's actually quite sympathetic. The article painted Victoria as a fragile woman whose pregnancy had triggered severe anxiety and paranoid delusions, with Blake as the devoted husband seeking the best medical care money could buy. Photos showed him looking concerned and loving beside Victoria's hospital bed. "You had photographers here." Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "Just one, very discreet. The narrative needed to be controlled before wild speculation began." Blake's tone was matter-of-fact, as if manipulating media coverage was perfectly normal. Dr. Thompson entered with discharge papers. "Mrs. Harrison, you're free to go home. However, I strongly recommend follow-up care with a psychiatrist I can refer you to." Blake stood smoothly. "Already arranged. Dr. Hartley is expecting us this afternoon." Victoria felt a chill. Dr. Hartley was the psychiatrist who'd written those reports painting her as unstable. "I'd prefer to choose my own doctor." "Sweetheart," Blake's voice carried that patient tone reserved for children and the mentally ill. "Dr. Hartley is the best in the city. He's already familiar with your case." As they prepared to leave, Victoria caught Dr. Thompson's eye. The physician had approached at her bedside, speaking quietly. "Mrs. Harrison, I want you to have my direct number. If you ever need medical attention and feel unsafe seeking it through normal channels, call me." Blake was suddenly at Victoria's shoulder. "That's very kind, doctor, but Victoria has excellent medical care arranged." The drive home was silent except for Blake's phone calls to his attorney, his public relations firm, and someone he referred to only as the cleaner. Victoria stared out the window at the city shooting by, wondering if she'd ever see it again from anywhere but the passenger seat of Blake's car. Their house, a sprawling estate in the most exclusive neighborhood, felt more like a prison than ever. Blake guided her to their bedroom with gentle hands that somehow felt like shackles. "I think you should rest before your appointment with Dr. Hartley," he said, pulling out a small white pill. "This will help with your anxiety." Victoria stared at the pill. "What is it?" "Just something to keep you calm. Dr. Hartley prescribed it after reviewing your medical history." "When did he review my medical history?" Blake's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Victoria, you're being paranoid again. Please take the medication." For a moment, Victoria considered refusing, but the weight of the morning's revelations, the manipulated news story, and Blake's suffocating presence wore down her resistance. She took the pill. Within an hour, she felt that familiar fuzzy distance settling over her thoughts. This was how she'd felt for months without understanding why. Blake had been drugging her systematically, keeping her compliant and confused. Dr. Hartley's office was exactly what Victoria expected. Expensive and intimidating, with degrees and awards covering every wall. The man himself was in his 60s, with cold eyes and a practiced smile. "Mrs. Harrison," he said without looking up from his notes, "your husband is very concerned about your recent behavior. The incident at the bank suggests your condition is worsening." "What condition?" Victoria asked, fighting through the medication's fog. "Pregnancy-induced psychosis with paranoid features. It's more common than people realize." Blake sat beside her, the picture of a concerned husband. "Doctor, is there any treatment that might help?" Dr. Hartley made notes into Victoria's file. "Continued medication, reduced stress, and limited contact with potential triggers. I'd recommend avoiding public places and stressful situations for the remainder of the pregnancy." Well, Victoria felt reality slipping away again. "Triggers like what?" "Well, returning to work would be inadvisable. Social gatherings might overstimulate you. Even contact with certain friends or family members could worsen your paranoid episodes." The prescription was elegant in its simplicity. Complete isolation disguised as medical care. As they left the office, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text for Sam Mitchell at the bank. Blake glanced at the screen and frowned. I think it would be best if you didn't use your phone for a while. The constant notifications seem to agitate you. Victoria handed over her phone without protest. The medication made resistance feel impossible, like trying to fight underwater. That evening, alone in their bedroom while Blake made more phone calls downstairs, Victoria stared at her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman staring back. For 18 months, Blake had been systematically destroying her identity, her connections, and her ability to think clearly. The incident at the bank had been a moment of clarity, a crack in his perfect system of control, but now the walls were closing in again, and Victoria could feel herself disappearing piece by piece. Tomorrow, their dog Hartley would increase her medication. Blake would tighten his control further, and Victoria would sink deeper into the fog that had become her existence, unless she found a way to fight back before it was too late. Detective Murphy wasn't giving up easily. 3 days after the hospital incident, he sat in his patrol car outside Blake Harrison's estate, waiting for any sign of Victoria. What he saw concerned him more than he'd expected. The windows that faced the street had been fitted with new security bars, ostensibly for protection, but effectively creating a prison. Groundskeepers who looked more like private security patrolled the property. A van from Hartley Medical Services made daily visits. Murphy's phone rang. Detective, this is Sam Mitchell from First National Bank. I think I have something you need to see. 20 minutes later, Murphy sat in Sam's office watching security footage from multiple angles. I've been going through our archives, Sam explained. Blake Harrison has been coming to the bank alone for months, accessing accounts that Victoria used to manage herself. The footage showed Blake systematically transferring money from Victoria's personal accounts into ones she couldn't access. Legal on paper, but devastating in practice. There's more, Sam continued. I did some digging into his previous relationships. His first wife died in a car accident 2 years ago. Single vehicle crash, ruled an accident, but she'd been planning to leave him. Murphy leaned forward. You think Harrison was involved? I think Blake Harrison is very good at making problems disappear permanently. Murphy's radio crackled, a domestic disturbance call from Harrison's address. His heart raced as he sped toward the estate. He arrived to find Blake on the front porch, speaking calmly to uniformed officers. My wife has been having episodes. She threw a lamp and started screaming about people trying to hurt her. I had to call for medical assistance. Through an upstairs window, Murphy could see Victoria being restrained by 2 men in medical scrubs. Even from the street, her terror was visible. Sir, one of the uniforms said to Murphy, Mr. Harrison says his wife is having a psychiatric emergency. Medical team is handling it. Murphy badged his way past the officers and into the house. Upstairs, he found Victoria in their bedroom, sedated but awake, with Dr. Hartley preparing an injection. What's in that syringe? Murphy demanded. Dr. Hartley looked annoyed. Detective, this is a medical situation. Miss Harrison is having a severe psychotic episode. Victoria, Murphy said, approaching the bed. Can you hear me? Her eyes focused on him with effort. Help me, she whispered. He's trying to make me disappear. Blake appeared in the doorway. Detective, as you can see, my wife is delusional. She believes everyone is conspiring against her. Murphy studied the scene. Victoria's wrists showed fresh restraint marks. The medical team had no official ambulance or EMT credentials visible. Dr. Hartley was preparing to inject an unknown substance into a pregnant woman. I'm going to need to see medical credentials and a court order for involuntary commitment, Murphy announced. Dr. Hartley paused with the syringe. This is a medical emergency, Detective. We don't have time for paperwork. Then you have time to wait while I verify your authority to treat this patient. Blake's composure finally cracked. Detective Murphy, you're interfering with my wife's medical care. Our attorney will be in touch with your department. Murphy held his ground. Mrs. Harrison, do you consent to this medical treatment? No, Victoria said as clearly as she could manage. I want to leave. She's not competent to make medical decisions. Blake interrupted. According to whom, I don't see any court-ordered guardianship papers. The standoff lasted another 10 minutes before Blake dismissed the medical team. Dr. Hartley left angrily. warning about liability issues and psychiatric emergencies. After the house cleared, Murphy sat beside Victoria's bed. The medication was wearing off, and her thinking seemed clearer. Mrs. Harrison, I need you to tell me exactly what happened today. Victoria's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I tried to call the number Dr. Thompson gave me. Blake found me with the phone and said I was having another episode. Then Dr. Hartley arrived with those men. Where's the phone now? Blake took it. He takes everything. Murphy pulled out his own phone and dialed Dr. Thompson's number. When she answered, he put the call on speaker. Dr. Thompson, this is Detective Murphy. I'm here with Mrs. Harrison. She says she tried to call you today. That's right. She called to report that she believes her husband has been drugging her systematically. I was preparing to meet with her when the call was cut off. Blake, who had been listening from the hallway, stepped into the room. Detective, my wife's paranoid delusions are worsening. She's now accusing me of poisoning her. Dr. Thompson's voice came through the phone clearly. Mr. Harrison, the blood work from your wife's hospital visit showed clear evidence of unauthorized sedatives. That's not a delusion. For the first time since Murphy had met him, Blake Harrison looked genuinely surprised. His careful control system was developing cracks. Murphy stood up. Mr. Harrison, I'm going to need you to surrender all medications you've been giving your wife. Those are prescribed treatments for her condition. Then you won't mind if Dr. Thompson analyzes them to confirm their contents match their labels. The pills Blake reluctantly produced were white and unmarked. Dr. Thompson agreed to rush the analysis. As Murphy prepared to leave, Victoria grabbed his arm. Detective, please don't leave me here alone with him. Blake immediately moved to his wife's side. Sweetheart, you're safe at home. This is where you belong. Murphy looked between them, seeing clearly for the first time how completely Blake had trapped his wife. Mrs. Harrison, if you feel unsafe, you can request protective custody. She's pregnant and emotionally unstable, Blake said quickly. Removing her from familiar surroundings would be traumatic. Victoria met Murphy's eyes. Despite the medication and fear, something determined flickered there. I want protection. Blake's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold fury underneath. You're making a serious mistake. Detective. Murphy smiled grimly. Mr. Harrison, I think the serious mistakes have already been made. As he called for a domestic violence advocate and protective custody arrangements, Murphy realized that Blake Harrison had just made his first tactical error. He'd revealed his control system in front of a police officer, medical professional, and bank manager. The Millionaire's perfect facade was beginning to crumble. Within hours of Victoria entering protective custody, Blake Harrison's public relations machine went into overdrive. Local news stations received press releases about a tragic situation involving his wife's pregnancy-related mental illness and his heartbreaking decision to seek professional intervention. Victoria watched the coverage from a secure room at Haven House, a domestic violence shelter that looked more like a modest apartment complex. Sam Mitchell sat beside her, having taken leave from the bank to help coordinate Victoria's support network. Pregnant millionaire's wife in psychiatric crisis, read the headline on Channel 7. Blake appeared on screen looking haggard and concerned, speaking with practiced emotion about Victoria's deteriorating condition. She's been struggling with severe paranoid delusions, Blake told the sympathetic reporter. Yesterday, she accused our family doctor of trying to poison her. I'm just trying to get her the help she needs while protecting our unborn child. Victoria felt sick watching Blake manipulate public opinion in real time. He's so convincing. What if people believe him? Sam muted the television. The people who matter won't believe him. Dr. Thompson's lab results came back this morning. Detective Murphy entered carrying a thick file folder. Victoria, the pills your husband was giving you contain 3 times the recommended dose of lorazepam, plus an experimental antipsychotic that's not approved for use in pregnant women. Victoria's hand went instinctively to her belly. Could it hurt the baby? Dr. Thompson, who had arrived moments earlier, sat down with Victoria's medical chart. We'll need to monitor closely, but the good news is that you haven't been taking the full doses. Your body was metabolizing the drug slower than Blake expected, probably due to the pregnancy. Murphy opened his file. There's more. We executed a search warrant on your house this morning. Blake's home office contained detailed medical records on you going back 18 months, including psychological profiles and medication schedules. He was tracking my responses to the drugs. Like a laboratory experiment, we also found files on 3 other women, including his deceased first wife. Victoria felt cold dread settling in her stomach. What kind of files? Murphy exchanged glances with Dr. Thompson before continuing. Psychological profiles, medical histories, financial records, and what appear to be contingency plans for each relationship. Sam leaned forward. Contingency plans, methods for discrediting them if they became problematic, legal strategies, media manipulation, financial isolation. Your husband is very thorough. Dr. Thompson checked her watch. Victoria, I know this is overwhelming, but we need to discuss your immediate medical needs. The baby appears healthy, but you'll need careful monitoring as these drugs leave your system. What about withdrawal symptoms? Some anxiety and confusion as your mind clears, but nothing dangerous. The bigger concern is Blake's likely response to losing control. As if summoned by her words, Murphy's phone rang. He listened for a moment, then hung up with a grim expression. Blake has hired Sinclair Security, the same firm used by international corporations for hostile takeovers. They're not just bodyguards. These are professionals trained in surveillance, intimidation, and information warfare. Victoria felt the walls closing in again. He's going to find me. Not necessarily, said a new voice from the doorway. A woman in her 30s entered, wearing a federal badge and carrying an official-looking briefcase. I'm Agent Claire Hudson, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Mr. Harrison's activities have attracted federal attention. Murphy raised an eyebrow. Since when does domestic violence fall under FBI jurisdiction? Agent Hudson sat down, opening her briefcase. Since we discovered that Blake Harrison has been using his real estate business to launder money for international criminal organizations, the systematic abuse of his wives appears to be connected to his money laundering operations. Victoria stared at her. How could my marriage be connected to money laundering? Your husband needed wives who appeared stable and successful to legitimize his business dealings. When they became too independent or started asking questions, he had to neutralize them quietly. Hudson spread photos across the table. Sarah Harrison, his first wife, was an accountant who discovered discrepancies in his books. Maria Santos, a girlfriend from 5 years ago, was a bank examiner who started investigating his transactions. Both died in apparent accidents after threatening to expose him. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. You're saying Blake kills women who threaten his business. Victoria's voice was barely audible. We're saying Blake Harrison is not just an abusive husband. He's a criminal who uses domestic violence as part of a larger criminal enterprise. Murphy leaned back in his chair. That changes everything. If this is part of a federal investigation, Victoria's not just fleeing domestic violence. She's a potential witness in a criminal case. Agent Hudson nodded, which means she has access to federal witness protection resources, but it also means she's in considerably more danger than we initially realized. Victoria felt her world shifting again, but this time towards something that might actually be hope. What does this mean for me and my baby? It means you're not fighting Blake Harrison alone anymore, Hudson replied. The full resources of the federal government are behind you now. Sam squeezed Victoria's hand. And it means every piece of evidence we gather doesn't just help you escape. It helps take down a criminal organization. Dr. Thompson made notes in Victoria's chart. From a medical standpoint, this explains the sophisticated nature of his drugging regimen. This wasn't amateur hour. Blake had professional help planning your psychological destruction. Victoria looked around the room at the faces of people who had rallied to her defense. For 18 months, Blake had systematically isolated her from everyone who cared about her, but he hadn't counted on new allies emerging from unexpected places. Agent Hudson, Victoria said quietly, what do you need me to do? Hudson smiled grimly. Help us put your husband where he belongs, in federal prison for the rest of his life. Outside Haven House, Blake Harrison sat in his car with a telephoto lens, photographing everyone who entered and left the building. He had no idea that federal agents were already watching him, building a case that would destroy everything he'd spent years creating. The war for Victoria's freedom was about to become a battle for Blake's empire, Blake Harrison didn't become a multimillionaire by accepting defeat gracefully. Within 48 hours of Victoria entering protective custody, his counterattack began with surgical precision. Victoria's mother, Helen Matthews, received a phone call from someone claiming to be a social worker. "Mrs. Matthews, I'm calling about your daughter, Victoria. We're concerned about her mental state and the safety of her unborn child." Helen, who lived 3 hours away and hadn't spoken to Victoria in months due to Blake's careful manipulation, was told that Victoria had suffered a complete psychotic break and was making wild accusations against her loving husband. "The court is considering emergency custody of the baby when it's born," the caller explained. "As the grandmother, your testimony about Victoria's mental health could be crucial." Similar calls went to Victoria's former colleagues, college friends, and distant relatives. Each caller presented themselves as concerned professionals seeking information about Victoria's deteriorating condition. Dr. Thompson was reviewing Victoria's latest lab results when she received a call from the state medical board. "Dr. Thompson, we've received a complaint about your treatment of Victoria Harrison. There are allegations that you've been encouraging a mentally ill patient to refuse necessary psychiatric care." The complaint, filed by Dr. Hartley, accused Thompson of reckless endangerment and professional misconduct in supporting Victoria's paranoid delusions about her husband. At Haven House, Victoria watched the systematic destruction of her support network through news reports and phone calls from increasingly worried friends and family members. "He's turning everyone against me," Victoria said to Agent Hudson, who was reviewing intelligence reports on Blake's activities. "My own mother thinks I've lost my mind." Hudson looked up from her files. "Your husband has hired the best reputation management firm in the country. They specialize in destroying credibility before trials begin." Sam burst into the room carrying her laptop. "It's worse than that. Someone leaked Victoria's location to the media. There are news vans outside." Victoria moved to the window and saw her reporters setting up cameras across the street. The headline on her phone read, "Pregnant wife barricades herself in shelter, refuses medical treatment." Murphy's voice came through the speakerphone. "Victoria, we need to move you. Blake's security team has been asking questions in the neighborhood. They know you're here." Agent Hudson was already packing her briefcase. "We have a safe house prepared. Federal protection until trial." Trial. Victoria felt overwhelmed. What trial? Blake's federal indictment came through this morning. Money laundering, conspiracy, and under the RICO Act, we can include the domestic violence as part of his criminal enterprise. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Tori, this is your mother. Please call me. I'm so worried about you and the baby. Blake says you need help." She showed the message to Hudson, who grimaced. "He's using your family to pressure you into returning voluntarily. It's more effective than legal coercion." Dr. Thompson entered the room looking shaken. "Victoria, I've been suspended pending investigation. They're claiming I encouraged you to refuse psychiatric treatment." The walls felt like they were closing in again. Victoria sank into a chair, one hand on her belly. "He's destroying everyone who tried to help me." "That's what abusers do when they lose control," Hudson said firmly. "They burn everything down rather than let their victims escape. But this time, he's making a crucial mistake." Sam looked up from her laptop. "What mistake?" "He's attacking federal witnesses and officers of the court. Every move he makes now becomes additional evidence of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice." Victoria's phone rang. Blake's name appeared on the screen. Hudson held up her hand. "Answer it." "We're recording everything." Victoria took a shaky breath and accepted the call. Blake's voice filled the room through the speaker. "Tori, sweetheart, I'm so worried about you. Your mother called me crying. She says people are telling her terrible lies about our marriage." Victoria found her voice. "They're not lies, Blake. Honey, you're sick. The pregnancy has affected your mind, and these people are taking advantage of your condition. I just want to bring you home so we can get you proper treatment." "The treatment that involves drugging me unconscious." Blake's voice remained patient. "Loving. Tori, you see how paranoid you sound. Dr. Hartley explained that this is a symptom of your condition. You're imagining things that never happened." Victoria felt the familiar fog of self-doubt creeping in. Blake was so convincing, so reasonable. What if she really was losing her mind? Agent Hudson caught her eye and nodded encouragingly. Blake, Victoria said more strongly, I know you've been drugging me. I know about the money laundering. I know about Sarah and Maria. The silence stretched for several seconds. When Blake spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. Tori, you have no idea what you're dealing with. I've built something bigger than you can understand, and I won't let you destroy it. Is that a threat? It's a promise you can come home voluntarily and we can work this out privately. Or you can continue down this path and discover exactly how many ways there are for pregnant women to have tragic accidents. The line went dead. Victoria stared at her phone, her hands shaking. He just threatened to kill me and my baby. Agent Hudson was already on her radio, coordinating with other federal agents, and he did it on a recorded line while making similar threats to federal witnesses. Blake Harrison just sealed his own fate. Murphy's voice crackled through the speakerphone. Hudson, we've got movement, multiple vehicles heading toward your location. Looks like private security. Hudson stood, drawing her weapon. Time to go. Everyone stay close. As they prepared to evacuate Haven House through a back exit, Victoria realized something had fundamentally changed. For the first time since this nightmare began, Blake had revealed his true nature to people with the power to stop him. His perfect mask of the concerned husband had finally slipped completely. The real Blake Harrison had just declared war on the federal buster government. The safe house was a modest ranch home in a suburban neighborhood 40 miles outside the city. Victoria sat in the living room watching news coverage of her own story, feeling like she was observing someone else's life falling apart. FBI raids Harrison real estate empire, read the headline. Footage showed federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from Blake's corporate offices while he stood on the sidewalk in handcuffs, flanked by expensive attorneys. But the victory felt hollow as Victoria's phone buzzed with increasingly desperate messages from family members who believed Blake's version of events. Her sister Rachel had texted Tori, Mom is in the hospital. Stress-induced heart attack. Please stop this madness and get help. Victoria's hands shook as she read the message. He's killing my mother with stress and using it to manipulate me. Agent Hudson looked up from her laptop. Victoria, your mother is fine. We checked with the hospital. She was treated for anxiety and released the same day. Blake's people probably told her something designed to trigger a panic attack. Dr. Thompson, who had been staying at the safe house since her suspension, monitored Victoria's vital signs daily. The baby is healthy, but your stress levels are dangerously high. Blake is still controlling your emotional state, even from prison. He's not in prison yet, Victoria said quietly. His bail hearing is tomorrow. Murphy had been coordinating with federal marshals on security. Hudson, we have a problem. Blake's attorneys are arguing that he's not a flight risk because his pregnant wife needs him. They're pushing for house arrest with electronic monitoring. Victoria felt nauseated. He could get out. His legal team is very good, Hudson admitted. They're painting him as a concerned husband whose mentally ill wife has been manipulated by federal agents looking to make headlines. The doorbell rang, causing everyone to freeze. Murphy drew his weapon as he approached the window. It's a courier, he announced. Official court documents. The papers were a custody petition filed by Blake's mother, claiming that Victoria was an unfit mother due to mental illness and drug abuse. Supporting documents included testimony from Dr. Hartley, statements from manipulated family members, and photographs of Victoria looking disheveled and unstable taken during her darkest moments. They're going to take my baby, Victoria whispered, reading through the legal filing. Even if Blake goes to prison, his family will get custody. Hudson studied the documents. This is sophisticated legal warfare. They're attacking on multiple fronts simultaneously. Victoria's phone rang. The caller ID showed her mother's number. Don't answer, Hudson warned, but Victoria was already accepting the call. Victoria, her mother's voice was thin and frail. Honey, please talk to me. I don't understand what's happening. Mom, I know you're scared, but Blake has been lying to you about everything. Sweetie, I saw the news reports. They're saying you've been doing drugs and living in homeless shelters. Blake showed me pictures of you looking so sick and thin. Victoria met Hudson's eyes desperately. Her mother continued, he says you need medical treatment, and these FBI people are preventing you from getting help. Victoria, if you're really pregnant, you need to think about your baby. Mom, Blake has been drugging me for months. The FBI has proof. Honey, that sounds like something a person with mental illness might believe. Blake loves you so much. He's been crying every time I talk to him. The conversation continued for 10 more minutes, with Victoria's mother becoming increasingly convinced that her daughter was delusional and that Blake was a victim of federal overreach. After hanging up, Victoria broke down completely. My own mother thinks I'm crazy. Blake has turned my entire family against me. Dear Thompson sat beside her on the couch. Victoria, this is what abusers do in their final stage. They create chaos and turn everyone against their victim to force them back into the relationship. Well, what if he's right? What if I am losing my mind? Hudson knelt in front of Victoria's chair. Victoria, look at me. You are not losing your mind. You are a victim of systematic psychological abuse by a criminal who has spent years perfecting these techniques. Murphy's phone buzzed with an urgent message. He read it and cursed under his breath. What is it? Hudson asked. Blake's bail hearing has been moved up. It's happening in 2 hours, and his legal team is requesting that Victoria be present to demonstrate her mental state to the court. Victoria felt the familiar paralysis setting in. If I go, he'll manipulate me in front of the judge. If I don't go, it looks like I'm hiding something. Hudson was already gathering her files. We're going, but we're going prepared. Thompson checked her medical bag. Victoria, I'm going to give you a mild sedative to help with anxiety, just enough to keep you calm but alert. As they prepared to leave for court, Victoria caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She looked exactly like the unstable woman Blake had been describing to everyone. Thin, pale, frightened, and desperate. For a moment, she wondered if Blake was right about everything. Then she felt her baby kick, and something fierce and protective surged through her. Whatever happened in that courtroom, she wouldn't let Blake destroy her child's life the way he'd destroyed hers. But as they drove toward downtown, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap that would finally give Blake everything he wanted. The federal courthouse downtown was surrounded by media vans and protesters. Signs reading "Justice for Pregnant Mothers" and "Stop Federal Overreach" created a chaotic scene that Blake's PR team had clearly orchestrated. Victoria sat in the back of Agent Hudson's unmarked car, watching Blake's supporters rally outside the courthouse. Many held photos of her looking disheveled and confused, with slogans like "Free Blake Harrison" and "Protect Family Rights." How did they get those photos? Victoria asked. Hudson studied the crowd grimly. Blake's been documenting your condition for months. Every time you look sick or confused from his drugging, he was building evidence for this moment. Murphy pointed to a news van. Channel 7 is running a live feed. The headline reads, "Millionaire husband fights federal agents for wife's medical freedom." Dr. Thompson checked Victoria's pulse. Your heart rate is elevated but stable. Remember, you just need to tell the truth clearly and calmly. As they entered the courthouse through a side entrance, Victoria could hear the crowd chanting Blake's name. Inside, the courtroom was packed with Blake's supporters, expensive attorneys, and federal prosecutors. Blake sat at the defendant's table looking perfectly groomed and composed. When Victoria entered, he turned to look at her with an expression of such loving concern that for a moment, she almost believed it herself. Judge Margaret Walsh, a stern woman in her 60s, called the hearing to order. Blake's lead attorney, Martin Crawford, immediately requested that Victoria be examined by the court's psychiatrist before any testimony. Your Honor, Crawford argued, Mrs. Harrison has been held against her will by federal agents who are exploiting her pregnancy-induced mental illness to build a case against her loving husband. Federal prosecutor David Chen stood to respond. Your Honor, Mrs. Harrison is a victim of systematic domestic abuse and drugging by the defendant. Any mental distress she exhibits is the direct result of his criminal actions. Judge Walsh studied Victoria carefully. Mrs. Harrison, are you able to testify on your own behalf today? Victoria stood on shaking legs. Blake's eyes never left her face, and she could feel his psychological control trying to reassert itself even across the courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, she managed to say. Crawford approached the witness stand. Mrs. Harrison, have you been taking any medications for anxiety or depression during your pregnancy? Victoria felt the familiar fog trying to descend over her thoughts. This was exactly how Blake had manipulated her for months, asking leading questions that made her doubt her own perceptions. I was given medications without my knowledge or consent. She answered clearly. Mrs. Harrison, do you recall accusing your family doctor of trying to poison you? I accused my husband of drugging me. The FBI lab analysis proved I was correct. Crawford smiled sympathetically. Mrs. Harrison, do you understand that pregnancy can sometimes cause women to have paranoid thoughts about the people who love them most? Before Victoria could answer, Hudson stood up in the gallery. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying rather than questioning. Judge Walsh sustained the objection, but Crawford had already planted the seed of doubt. Mrs. Harrison, Crawford continued, your husband has provided extensive medical documentation of your declining mental state. Do you believe all of your doctors are lying? Victoria felt herself starting to dissociate, a defense mechanism her mind had developed during Blake's worst psychological attacks. The courtroom seemed to fade away as Crawford's voice continued, suggesting that she was delusional, that Blake was a victim, that federal agents were manipulating her. Then she heard Blake's voice from the defendant's table, speaking to his attorney but loud enough for her to hear, she's having another episode. This is exactly what I was worried about. The sound of Blake's manipulative concerns snapped Victoria back to full awareness. Suddenly up and she could see the entire courtroom clearly. Blake's fake worried expression, Crawford's leading questions, the stacked deck of Blake's supporters in the room. Your Honor, Victoria said firmly, interrupting Crawford mid-question. I need to say something, Judge Walsh nodded. Proceed, Mrs. Harrison. Victoria turned to face Blake directly. For 18 months, you systematically destroyed my ability to think clearly. You drugged me, isolated me from everyone who cared about me, and made me believe I was losing my mind. Blake started to stand, but his attorney pulled him back down. Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger. You told me I was paranoid when I questioned why I felt confused all the time. You said I was delusional when I noticed money disappearing from our accounts. You convinced everyone around me that I was mentally ill, while you were deliberately making me sick. Crawford objected, but Judge Walsh overruled him. But the worst part, Victoria said, tears streaming down her face, is that you made me doubt myself so completely that even now, standing in this courtroom with FBI evidence proving everything I've said, part of me still wonders if you're right about me being crazy. She wiped her eyes and looked directly at Judge Walsh. Your Honor, that's what systematic psychological abuse does to a person. It doesn't just hurt you, it makes you complicit in your own destruction. The courtroom was completely silent. But I'm 6 months pregnant, Victoria continued, and I will not let this man destroy my child's life the way he destroyed mine. Judge Walsh made notes for several minutes before speaking. Mr. Harrison, based on the evidence presented and Mrs. Harrison's testimony, I'm denying your bail request. You will remain in federal custody pending trial. Blake's mask finally slipped completely. He stood up and shouted, You're making a mistake. Victoria needs medical treatment, not encouragement for her delusions. Federal marshals moved to restrain him as he continued yelling about corrupt federal agents and his wife's mental illness. As Blake was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Victoria one last time. The expression on his face was pure hatred, with no trace of the loving husband act he'd maintained for months. Outside the courthouse, Victoria leaned against Agent Hudson's car, emotionally drained but feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, the certainty that she had told the truth and been believed. Victoria, Hudson said quietly, you just did something incredibly brave. Victoria watched the news vans packing up, knowing that tomorrow's headlines would be very different from today's. I just told the truth. For the first time in 18 months, I told the truth about my own life. Dr. Molly Thompson checked Victoria's vital signs one more time. How do you feel? Victoria considered the question carefully. Scared, sad, but not crazy. For the first time since this nightmare began, that felt like progress. 3 months later, Victoria sat in the federal courthouse again, but this time as a witness in Blake Harrison's criminal trial. Her baby daughter, Emma, slept peacefully in her arms, born healthy despite everything Blake had put them both through. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case. Financial records showed Blake had laundered over $50 million through his real estate empire. Medical evidence proved systematic drugging of multiple victims. Testimony from other survivors painted a clear picture of a serial predator who used domestic violence as part of his criminal operations. But Blake's defense team had one final strategy, painting Victoria as an unreliable witness whose testimony had been coerced by federal agents seeking to build a high-profile case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, defense attorney Crawford addressed the court. Victoria Harrison is a troubled woman who has been manipulated by ambitious federal prosecutors. Her so-called evidence of abuse consists of her own confused memories and circumstantial medical tests. Victoria watched from the witness gallery as Crawford systematically attacked her credibility, her mental health, and her motivations. It was Blake's gaslighting campaign played out in legal terms. Then Prosecutor Chen called Agent Hudson to the stand. Agent Hudson, please tell the jury about the other victims in this case. Hudson opened a thick file. Over the past 3 years, we've identified 8 women who were systematically abused by Blake Harrison. 3 are dead, allegedly from accidents or suicide. 5 others were paid substantial sums to sign non-disclosure agreements and never speak about their experiences. Crawford objected, but Judge Walsh allowed the testimony to continue. Agent Hudson, what pattern did you observe in Mr. Harrison's treatment of these women? Each relationship followed the same progression: intense courtship, gradual isolation, financial control, psychological manipulation through drugs or gaslighting, and finally when the woman threatened to leave or expose him, either death or systematic character assassination. Hudson presented photos, medical records, and financial documents for each victim. The evidence was overwhelming and methodical. Agent Hudson, in your professional opinion, was Victoria Harrison's experience unique? No. Victoria Harrison was simply the first victim who had enough support to survive Blake Harrison's destruction process and testify against him. When Crawford cross-examined Agent Hudson, he focused on federal overreach and prosecutorial ambition. But the evidence spoke for itself. Then Victoria was called to testify. She approached the witness stand holding Emma, who had become her source of strength throughout the trial. Blake watched from the defendant's table, still projecting injured innocence despite the mountain of evidence against him. Prosecutor Chen began gently. Mrs. Harrison, can you tell the jury about the early days of your relationship with the defendant? Victoria described Blake's intense courtship, his apparent devotion, and the gradual changes that followed their marriage. She spoke clearly and calmly, no longer the confused woman who had been gaslit into doubting her own reality. When did you first realize something was wrong? When I started losing time, Victoria replied. I would have conversations I couldn't remember, make decisions that didn't seem like something I would do. Blake always had explanations, usually involving pregnancy hormones or stress. How did the defendant respond when you questioned these episodes? He would become very concerned and loving. He'd suggest I was working too hard or worrying too much. He'd schedule doctor's appointments and handle my medications. At the time, it felt like he was taking care of me. Victoria testified for 3 hours, describing the systematic destruction of her independence, her relationships, and her sense of reality. She spoke about the drugging, the financial control, and the moment in the bank when she finally asked for help. When Crawford cross-examined her, he tried to paint her as an unstable woman with false memories. Mrs. Harrison, isn't it true that you've been diagnosed with pregnancy-induced psychosis? I was diagnosed by Dr. Hartley, who was being paid by my husband to provide false medical reports. Mrs. Harrison, how can the jury trust your testimony when you admit to having episodes where you lost time and couldn't remember events clearly? Victoria looked directly at the jury. Because those episodes were caused by drugs my husband was giving me without my knowledge. The FBI lab analysis proved that, when the drugs left my system, my memory and thinking became clear again. Crawford pressed harder. Mrs. Harrison, isn't it possible that your husband was genuinely trying to help you with a real medical condition? Victoria was quiet for a moment, then answered with complete certainty. Sir, if my husband had been trying to help me, he wouldn't have needed to lie about what medications he was giving me. He wouldn't have needed to cut me off from my friends and family. And he certainly wouldn't have needed to threaten to kill me and my baby when I tried to leave. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Blake Harrison was found guilty on all counts: money laundering, conspiracy, witness tampering, domestic violence, and under the RICO Act, operating a criminal enterprise. Judge Walsh sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. As federal marshals led Blake away for the final time, he looked back at Victoria with the same cold hatred she'd seen in the courthouse months earlier. But this time, Victoria felt no fear. No doubt, no residual psychological control. Blake Harrison had lost the ability to manipulate her reality. Outside the courthouse, Victoria spoke briefly to reporters while holding Emma. "I want other women to know that if you think something is wrong in your relationship, trust your instincts. If someone is making you doubt your own perceptions, that's a warning sign. And if you need help, ask for it. There are people who will believe you and fight for you." Agent Hudson stood beside her. And the Harrison case has led to new federal protocols for investigating domestic violence in connection with other crimes. Victoria's courage has changed how we handle these cases nationwide. As the media attention faded and life began to return to normal, Victoria realized that her experience, as terrible as it had given her something valuable: absolute clarity about her own strength and the importance of believing survivors. She had survived a predator who thought he was untouchable. She had testified against a criminal organization with unlimited resources. She had protected her daughter and helped other women find justice. Blake Harrison had tried to destroy her identity and steal her time. Instead, he had given her a purpose and a voice that would help other women survive what she had survived. Justice, Victoria realized, sometimes looked like living well despite everything someone tried to do to destroy you. 1 year later, Victoria stood at the podium in a crowded conference room, addressing the National Domestic Violence Prevention Summit. Emma, now a healthy toddler, played quietly with toys at Victoria's feet while hundreds of advocates, law enforcement officers, and survivors listened to her speak. The Harrison case changed how federal law enforcement approaches domestic violence, Victoria told the audience. But more importantly, it proved that even the most sophisticated abusers can be stopped when survivors are believed and supported. In the audience, Agent Hudson smiled proudly. She had been promoted to head the FBI's new Domestic Violence Criminal Enterprise Task Force, inspired directly by Victoria's case. Detective Murphy, now running training programs for police departments nationwide, nodded approvingly as Victoria described the importance of recognizing psychological abuse as a precursor to physical violence. Thompson, who had been vindicated and reinstated after Blake's conviction, had become a leading researcher in the medical community's response to domestic violence. Sam Mitchell had left banking to run a nonprofit organization that helped domestic violence survivors rebuild their financial independence. "The network that formed around my case continues to grow," Victoria continued. "We've helped over 300 women escape dangerous relationships and rebuild their lives safely." After her speech, Victoria was approached by a young woman who looked familiar in a heartbreaking way. She had the hollow-eyed appearance Victoria remembered from her own darkest days. "Mrs. Harrison," the woman said quietly, "my name is Jessica Walsh. I think my boyfriend might be doing to me what your husband did to you." Victoria knelt down to Jessica's level, recognizing the courage it had taken to ask for help. "Tell me what's been happening." Over the next hour, Jessica described a pattern Victoria knew intimately: gradual isolation, financial control, mysterious medications for anxiety, and increasing confusion about her own perceptions. "Jessica," Victoria said gently, "everything you're describing sounds exactly like what happened to me. You're not crazy, and you're not alone." Agent Hudson joined their conversation, explaining the federal resources available for cases involving systematic abuse. Dr. Cardine Thompson offered immediate medical evaluation to test for unauthorized substances. Sam Mitchell provided information about emergency financial assistance. Within days, Jessica was safely removed from her dangerous situation with the full support of the network that had grown around Victoria's case. 3 months later, Victoria received a photo from Jessica, a young woman with clear eyes and a genuine smile, holding the keys to her own apartment and a certificate from her new job training program. Victoria kept the photo on her desk next to dozens of others from women who had escaped dangerous relationships with help from the resources and protocols developed after Blake's prosecution. Emma toddled over to Victoria's desk, babbling happily in the way of healthy toddlers. She had no memory of the danger she'd been born into. no knowledge of the man who had tried to control and destroy their lives. Emma would grow up knowing her mother as a strong woman who had survived something terrible and used that experience to help others. She would never know the confused, frightened woman Victoria had been during Blake's systematic campaign of abuse. Sometimes Victoria wondered what would have happened if Sam hadn't been working at the bank that day, if Agent Hudson's investigation hadn't uncovered Blake's broader criminal activities, if any number of coincidences hadn't aligned to save her life. But she had learned not to dwell on alternate histories. Instead, she focused on the present reality. Blake Harrison was in federal prison for life. She and Emma were safe and thriving, and the network of people who had saved them continued to save others. That evening, as Victoria put Emma to bed in their peaceful apartment, her daughter looked up with Blake's blue eyes, but Victoria's determined expression. "Mama's strong," Emma said clearly, one of her first complete sentences. Victoria smiled, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Yes, baby, Mama is strong, and so are you." Outside their window, the city lights twinkled peacefully. Victoria had reclaimed her life, her voice, and her future. She had transformed her worst experience into a force for protecting other women. Blake Harrison had tried to make her disappear. Instead, he had helped her become exactly who she was meant to be: a survivor, an advocate, and a woman who refused to let anyone face danger alone. In the end, that was justice, not just punishment for the perpetrator, but transformation and empowerment for the survivor. Victoria turned off the lights and settled into the peaceful routine of a life lived in safety and truth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women who needed help, new opportunities to ensure that what happened to her would help prevent the same thing from happening to others. She had survived. She had testified. She had protected her daughter and helped other women find their voices. Sometimes, that was enough to change the world.